Playground. Afternoon light. An ordinary day that smelled like cut grass and warm plastic from the slides. A father stood near the fence, half listening to the rhythm of children laughing, when a little girl froze mid-sentence. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared. Then she lifted her small hand and pointed at the man's forearm. Her voice steady in a way children's voices rarely are when something feels wrong. "My mom has that exact same tattoo." The words landed quietly, but they changed the temperature of the moment. The tattoo wasn't common. Not a heart, not a name. It was a thin compass rose with a missing point, inked slightly crooked, as if the artist's hand had trembled. The woman who shared it was supposed to be dead. The father hadn't spoken her name in years, not out loud, not even in prayer. And yet there it was, exposed by a rolled sleeve, as undeniable as the sun on the swings. By the end of the story, what he discovers will challenge everything he believed about loss, and reveal why some truths don't surface until we're ready to face them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The father's name was Daniel, the kind of name you wouldn't remember twice if you passed him in a grocery store. He worked nights maintaining municipal water systems, the kind of job that left your hands smelling faintly of metal and chlorine no matter how much you washed. He had learned to keep his sleeves down. He had learned to keep his past folded and tucked away. When the little girl spoke, Daniel felt his throat tighten, a reflex he thought grief had trained out of him. He crouched to her height, his knees popping, his voice careful. "That's interesting," he said, choosing a word that felt safer than the truth. The girl nodded as if confirming a fact she already knew. "It's on her arm. She showed me once when I was sick," she said. Her eyes flicked toward the sandbox where a woman watched, phone in hand. Daniel stood too quickly. The playground noise returned, loud and thin, like a radio slightly out of tune. He told himself coincidences happen. He told himself tattoos are copied. He told himself he had buried Emily 6 years ago, and that funerals end things. 6 months earlier, Daniel's days had been smaller. Wake up, coffee that tasted burned. Drop his son, Noah, at school. Work, sleep, repeat. Emily's absence had settled into the furniture, into the way he cooked too much pasta and always forgot to salt the water. They had met young, both working at a diner off the interstate. She laughed with her whole body, a sound that made customers linger. The tattoo had been a spontaneous decision on a road trip, a map unfolded on the hood of their car, rain threatening. "For direction," she'd said, "even when we're lost." The missing point was a joke between them. When Emily died in a single-car accident on a wet curve, Daniel memorized the official words. Hydroplaning, impact, immediate. He learned the smell of lilies. He learned how to sign his name on forms that ended conversations. He learned how to answer Noah's questions without answering them at all. Back at the playground, Daniel forced himself to breathe through his nose, the way a counselor once taught him. He watched the woman by the sandbox laugh at something on her phone, then look up and meet his eyes with polite distance. He considered walking away. He considered apologizing for nothing. The little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Her name's Claire," she said, as if names were keys. Daniel nodded and introduced himself to the woman, whose name was Megan. Their small talk was ordinary to the point of pain. Weather, schools, the price of apples. Daniel's eyes betrayed him, drifting to Megan's forearm, bare in the heat. No tattoo. He told himself to stop. When Claire ran off, Megan smiled. "Kids say funny things," she said. Daniel smiled back, the muscles in his face aching. "They do," he agreed, and meant something else entirely. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He lay on his couch listening to the refrigerator hum and the occasional car pass, a sound like distant surf. He replayed the girl's tone, the way she hadn't asked a question. He remembered the missing point on the compass, the slight wobble. He told himself memory fills in gaps. He told himself grief looks for mirrors. Before dawn, he pulled an old box from the closet. Inside were photos that smelled faintly of dust and time. Emily at the beach, hair pulled back, laughing. Emily holding Noah, exhausted and proud. Emily's arm, the compass rose just visible beneath a rolled sleeve. Daniel's chest tightened in a way that felt like recognition. He asked himself what you would ask yourself if this were you. Would you protect the life you rebuilt, or would you risk opening a door you had nailed shut? 2 weeks later, Daniel returned to the playground. He told himself it was for Noah that routines mattered. Claire was there again, shoes untied, confidence unearned. She waved like they were old friends. "Hi," she said. Daniel smiled, cautious. Megan arrived moments later, apologetic about the heat, about nothing at all. They talked longer this time. Daniel mentioned the tattoo carefully. Megan frowned, genuinely confused. "I don't have any," she said. Daniel nodded. "Her mom?" he asked, his voice almost steady. Megan hesitated. "Claire's mom passed away," she said. The words practiced, softened by repetition. Daniel felt the ground tilt. "When?" he asked. "4 years ago," Megan said. The timeline hit him like cold water. Emily's accident had been 6 years ago. He heard himself say he was sorry. Megan said thank you. The conversation ended politely, like a door closing without a slam. The source of this story, as it was later pieced together, came from a series of local reports about mistaken identities and the ways communities fill gaps with assumptions. Daniel didn't know that then. He only knew the feeling that followed him home, a weight behind the eyes. He drove past the old diner, the sign flickering, the parking lot empty. He remembered a fight, the last one that mattered, about leaving town, about starting over. Emily had wanted to go west. Daniel had wanted stability. They had gone to bed angry. The accident came a week later. The official story had been neat. Too neat, maybe. Daniel began making phone calls he had avoided. Insurance, the hospital, the police department. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Some answers didn't line up. A report referenced an unidentified woman brought in briefly, transferred, then listed under a similar name. Similar. Daniel's hands shook as he took notes, the pen squeaking like a complaint. 3 months later, Daniel found himself sitting across from a woman in a community center office that smelled of old coffee. She introduced herself as a volunteer who helped reunite families separated by disasters. She listened without interrupting, a rare skill. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "Sometimes," she said, "people choose disappearance over confrontation." Daniel flinched. The idea felt like betrayal and relief braided together. He thought of Emily's laugh, her compass rose. He thought of Noah's questions. He thought of Claire's certainty. The volunteer explained how records can fracture, how names can slide. She didn't promise answers. She promised effort. Daniel left with a list and a feeling he couldn't name. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday, 6 months after the playground. Daniel stood outside a modest house 2 towns over, the gutters overflowing, the air smelling like wet earth. He knocked, then almost turned away. The door opened. The woman who stood there was thinner than memory, older in ways grief understands. Her forearm was bare. Daniel felt foolish. Then she shifted, and the sleeve fell back. The compass rose, the missing point. Emily's eyes filled with tears before his did. "Daniel," she said, like a question and an answer at once. She hadn't died. She had been injured, disoriented, afraid to return to a life she felt she had already failed. She had let a mistake harden into a choice. She had watched from a distance, convinced it was kinder. Claire was her niece. Megan was her sister-in-law. The tattoo had been a promise she hadn't known how to keep. A year later, the house felt fuller. Not easy, fuller. Emily met Noah slowly, with guidance, with honesty. There were apologies that didn't fix everything. There were dinners that tasted like hope and fear. Daniel learned that loss isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a pause filled with bad decisions and good intentions colliding. As you listen to this, ask yourself how you would have reacted at that playground. Would you have walked away? Would you have asked one more question? If you were Emily, would you have found the courage to knock? And if you were Daniel, would you have chosen certainty over truth? Stories like this don't offer clean lessons. They offer mirrors. And sometimes, if we're willing to look, they offer direction, even with a missing point. Evan Mercer was the kind of man people described with words like steady and reliable, not because he tried to be, but because life had stripped him of the option to be anything else. He was a single father, widowed, Or at least that was the truth he had been living with for years. And he raised his son alone in a small rented house where the floors creaked and the mailbox leaned slightly to the left. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Wake up before the alarm. Brew coffee he barely tasted. Wake his son gently, never rushing, never snapping, even when time was tight. Breakfast was simple. Toast. Eggs on weekends. He packed lunches with quiet care. Notes written once a week because he didn't know what else to say anymore. After school drop-off, Evan went straight to work, kept his head down, did his job well, came home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, and pretended the evenings didn't stretch longer than they should. Nights were the hardest, though Evan rarely admitted that, not even to himself. After his son fell asleep, the house grew too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears and makes you aware of every thought you've been avoiding all day. He washed the same dishes twice just to hear water running. He kept the television on low, not to watch it, but to keep the silence from pressing too close. There were rooms he barely entered and boxes he never opened. Certain songs were skipped immediately. Certain streets were avoided without conscious effort. And always, there was the tattoo on his forearm, usually hidden beneath long sleeves even in summer. It wasn't just ink. It was a reminder of a promise once made, a direction chosen together, and a life that was supposed to unfold a certain way. Evan never imagined that tattoo would ever matter again. Years earlier, long before Evan's life narrowed into routines and responsibility, there had been a different version of him. One that laughed louder, stayed out later, and believed time would always stretch to make room for whatever came next. College was where he met her. Not in a dramatic way. Just two people reaching for the same book in a quiet aisle, exchanging a look that lingered a second longer than necessary. Their love didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, through late-night talks, shared meals, and plans that felt solid simply because they were spoken out loud. The tattoo came during those years not as a fashion choice, not as something to show off, but as a private decision made on a day that mattered only to them. It was shared, the same placement, the same design, a mark that meant something only if you knew the story behind it. Very few people ever knew about that tattoo. It wasn't something Evan mentioned in conversation, and it wasn't something she ever explained to friends. There were no photos online, no posts, no casual comments. It wasn't public knowledge. It wasn't common. Even now, years later, Evan kept it covered without thinking, as if protecting it from the world protected the memory attached to it. Which is why that moment at the playground wouldn't leave him alone. A child had seen it once, briefly, and recognized it instantly. Not guessed, not questioned, recognized. So how could a child know something that had never been shared? Evan didn't ask questions right away. He'd learned that some truths retreat if you chase them too fast. He waited until the girl sat beside him on the low concrete edge near the swings, her sneakers scraping softly as she kicked her feet. His voice stayed light, careful not to frighten her or himself. He asked her how old she was, what grade she liked best, the kinds of things adults ask when they're buying time. She answered easily, then circled back on her own, pointing again at his forearm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She said her mom had one just like it. Same place, same shape. She added details Evan hadn't asked for, details children don't invent unless they've seen something up close. She said her mom called it her reminder. She said her mom once traced it with her finger when she thought no one was watching. The girl talked about her mom the way kids do when they're trying to explain someone important. She said her mom laughed quietly, not loud like other parents. She said her mom hated being in pictures and always found a reason to stand behind the camera. She mentioned a nickname Evan hadn't heard in years, a shortened version of a name only a few people had ever used. Evan felt his stomach tighten. He asked how old her mom was. The number came back without hesitation, lining up too perfectly with the life Evan had sealed off in his mind. He nodded, pretending he was just listening, while something inside him began to push back hard. Hope was a dangerous thing. Evan knew that. Hope had teeth. Grief at least had rules. You learned to live around it. You learned which days were heavier and which ones passed quietly. Hope shattered that balance. Hope asked you to reopen rooms you'd locked for survival. As the girl kept talking, Evan felt himself resisting the pull, forcing his face to stay neutral, forcing his voice to stay calm, because wanting this to mean something hurt more than believing it couldn't. Evan didn't confront anyone. He didn't demand explanations or push his way into a story that wasn't yet his to enter. Instead, he did what he had learned to do over years of quiet endurance. He observed. From a distance. From the edges. He came to the park at the same time each week, sat on the same bench, pretended to read the same book. He wasn't watching people so much as he was noticing patterns, the way someone notices weather before a storm. The girl always arrived with different adults. Sometimes an older woman, sometimes a younger man, never the same person twice, and never the mother the girl talked about so easily. Evan told himself there could be reasonable explanations. Work schedules, illness, convenience. Still, the absence pressed on him. Over time, the details stacked up. The girl was dropped off early and picked up late. The handoffs were quick, efficient, almost rehearsed. No lingering goodbyes, no waves. Evan noticed how the adults avoided the center of the park, how they stayed near the edges, as if wary of being seen too clearly. The woman the girl described so vividly never appeared. Not once. Evan began to recognize the routes, the timing, the subtle changes that suggested planning rather than chance. And that's when the feeling shifted. It wasn't that she was hiding from him. It felt like she was hiding from the past. For years, Evan had lived inside an official story that required no further questions. An accident, sudden and final. The kind of explanation that comes wrapped in paperwork and signatures, stamped and filed until it feels permanent. The case was considered closed quickly, almost mercifully so. There were reports, dates, and quiet assurances that everything that could be known had already been known. No lingering investigation. No loose ends anyone wanted to pull. Evan had accepted it because he needed something solid to stand on, something that would let him keep moving forward without looking back. The story asked very little of him beyond belief. But belief came at a cost. There were conversations that never happened, apologies left unspoken, plans that remained half-formed in his mind. Evan carried guilt in ordinary ways. In the pause before answering his son's questions. In the instinct to say, maybe later, instead of, tell me more. He blamed himself for not searching deeper, for not pushing when the details felt thin, for trusting that the absence of answers meant there were none to find. At the time, digging would have meant reopening wounds he was barely surviving. Accepting the explanation hurt less than questioning it. And that raises a quiet, uncomfortable thought. How many of us accept answers because the alternative hurts too much? The shift didn't come from a confession or a sudden revelation. It came quietly, the way most life-altering truths do, hidden in paperwork most people never read twice. Evan found it late one night, sitting at his kitchen table while the house slept, a single lamp casting a tired circle of light. He had requested old records under the pretense of closure, not expecting anything more than confirmation of what he already believed. Instead, there it was, a hospital intake form, slightly yellowed at the edges, with a name misspelled by one letter. One letter that could be dismissed as a typo. One letter that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The date on the document didn't align with the story Evan had memorized. It overlapped in a way that made no sense. According to the official timeline, she couldn't have been there. According to this record, she was transferred, stabilized, then discharged under a variation of the same name he had whispered for years and avoided saying out loud. Evan sat back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him, his pulse loud in his ears. She hadn't died the way he was told. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought confusion sharp enough to sting, anger that had nowhere to land, and a fragile thread of hope he didn't trust himself to hold. His mind raced ahead before he could stop it. If she didn't die, then where did she go? Evan didn't jump to conclusions because every possibility carried weight, and none of them felt simple. He began to imagine reasons that weren't cruel, reasons that lived in the gray spaces people avoid when they want clean answers. Protection came first to mind. The idea that someone might disappear not to escape a life, but to shield it from something unseen. Then there was trauma, the kind that fractures memory and reshapes fear, leaving a person convinced that staying is more dangerous than leaving. Evan considered the possibility that the decision hadn't even been hers alone, that someone else had stepped in during a moment when she couldn't advocate for herself, steering events in a direction that became harder to reverse with each passing day. None of these explanations brought peace. They brought tension, questions that refused to settle. Evan asked himself whether leaving could ever be justified, whether survival sometimes demands choices that look unforgivable from the outside. He wondered what he would have done if she had come back then, frightened and uncertain, asking for time instead of forgiveness. Would he have listened, or would the hurt have been too loud? The questions followed him through his days and into his sleep, unresolved and heavy, because understanding her reasons meant confronting his own capacity to forgive. Claire didn't know the secret she carried. Not really. To her, the tattoo was just a shape, a design her mother had shown once and forgotten in the shuffle of daily life. She had no idea that it was meant to be hidden, never to surface, never to mark a path back into Evan's life. And yet, there it was, pointing him toward a truth he had spent years accepting as impossible. It wasn't intention or planning that brought this moment. It was something far quieter, far more subtle. Fate had nudged, guided, and unfolded events in ways no one could have mapped, until all the pieces found a point of contact. Evan watched her, realizing that the innocence of a child had done what years of searching and sorrow could not. Children don't keep secrets, they reveal them. Every word, every gesture, every unfiltered observation carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. And in that moment, the path forward was no longer hidden. The story he thought had ended was only beginning, shaped not by careful strategy or deliberate planning, but by the unerring truth that innocence often brings. The full truth didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, in pieces that fit together only when Evan allowed himself to listen without judgment. She hadn't disappeared to punish him, or to escape love. She had left because the accident hadn't just taken a life. It had taken stability, safety, and a sense of who she could be. She couldn't come back then, not without fracturing everything she feared she would break. And the child, Claire, existed as a bridge between past and present, a living thread connecting choices made in fear to the love that never truly vanished. When Evan finally saw her again, it wasn't in a rush of tears or desperate shouting. It was quiet, a slow, measured meeting in a neutral space, eyes searching, voices careful. Words stumbled at first, apologies whispered rather than declared. Grief shifted into understanding as the weight of years pressed down and lifted all at once. And in that moment, Evan realized something vital. Love hadn't ended. It had paused, waiting for the courage, the timing, and the innocence of a child to remind him that some bonds survive even the longest absences. In the months that followed, Evan learned to navigate a life reshaped but not broken. Boundaries were established carefully, gently, no rushed conversations, no unrealistic expectations. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a single act. It grew slowly, like sunlight through a winter window, warming corners of his heart he thought would remain cold. Acceptance, he realized, was its own kind of freedom. He could love again, care again, without pretending the past had been simple or without scars. The future wasn't perfect. There were still quiet moments when memories tugged sharply, when questions flickered and refused to be fully answered. But it was honest. There was laughter in the house, cautious but real. There was connection, not always easy but present. And Evan understood, finally, that closure doesn't always come in the form of full answers. Sometimes closure is simply peace. Sometimes it's knowing that love survives even the gaps, even the silence, even the years you never thought would end. You believe some people are meant to find each other again. No matter how much time passes, even after years of absence, even after grief and mistakes, sometimes the heart remembers paths the mind has forgotten. Sometimes love doesn't end. It waits quietly until the moment it can return. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more, and let us share these journeys together. Stories of loss, hope, and the surprising ways life reminds us what really matters.